Hi.
Hi. Oxygen is running low, and I think we're a bit behind schedule, which is what one could also say about the platform economy from a European perspective. I'm very glad to have you here, Paul-Bernhard, Kallen, Mathias, Döpfner. Thank you, Steffi, for the wonderful introduction. I'm sure you would have preferred to talk about platforms in a media economy, but given as things are, it's media and the platform economy. You both have come with an agenda, but only one of you, I think, brings back very fond memories to Brussels, because if I'm correct, you did work here as a culture and arts correspondent for Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung in the early 1990s. And I hope I'm not being totally indiscreet by sharing a bit of your work ethics from the time with a very trustworthy DLD audience, because I think you had one iron rule when you were a correspondent here, which was under no circumstance would you write too many articles. And I could explain, because I still remember your explanation, but I think you can explain it much better.
No, you know, I worked for the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung in the golden times of print journalism, and I worked for the feuilleton, so that was the kind of intellectual lead. And the most important thing you had to avoid is to get the image of somebody who is working hard, because if you're working hard, you cannot be a genius. And so if you wrote, let's say, every 2 weeks one article, then the likelihood that you could be seen as a genius was high. If you delivered an article per day, you were just a kind of boring work rat or something like that. So that's why I really got sick, because I always wanted to write and I couldn't send the articles because otherwise I would ruin my image. So it was a difficult conflict I had.
So you chose a different career path. Things have changed.
Significantly.
Exactly, dramatically. Paul-Bernhard, Kallen, Mathias Döpfner just stated it, golden age of journalism. Is it gone? Will it come back?
Why don't you ask me on Belgium, by the way?
Okay,
I
you also
spent my
have
summer
fond
vacation
memory.
in Belgium, on
In
the coast,
Knokke.
Close to Knokke, and the only thing that I ever wrote in Belgium have been love letters, because my wife was not with me, and I had to write letters in the old days.
To her?
To her.
Great.
Desperate letters.
Brilliant.
So
But
hardly I worked.
shifting from Belgium, wonderful country, great food, great coast, to journalism, again, is the golden age of journalism gone? Are we going to see another one?
No, I think we are in very interesting times for it. We have to fight for the next development in journalism, but I can't see that we have democracy surviving without independent journalism. So in case we are pessimistic about journalism, we should be very pessimistic about the way we live and about the parameters we are living in, about democracy. And I am not. I understand that we have to find new ways, that we have to find new ways to finance journalism, and be in the middle of it, or maybe we are 60% through it. But I'm absolutely not pessimistic about it.
I'm going to come back to
I have more radical views. May I share it with you? No.
Go ahead.
Okay. So I think the old system of journalism is completely broken for two reasons. One, business-wise, because the business model is dead, and because analog journalism is going to disappear. And secondly, and more importantly, because intellectually, majority of established journalism is in a way missing its role. For that reason, I think we are at a turning point. This era is over. But at the same time, and I'm as radical in my optimism with regard to the next phase, I think the real golden times are still ahead of us, because a new generation of publishers and a new generation of digital native journalists is going to develop over the next years and decades, and they will replace most of the old brands. They will have new and perhaps even better work ethics, and that digital journalism provides opportunities that the quality of the content and the way to distribute the content and to interact with the reader are much, much better than in analog times. That seems to me pretty obvious. So I only see reasons why we are at a turning point, but the real golden times, the best times are ahead of us.
I was about to ask you what keeps you up at night and what makes you get up in the morning, but I think you just answered both questions in one answer. But coming back to the platform economy, if we look at the platforms, if we look at social media, I'm jumping a bit ahead, they revolutionized media consumption. And I'm, let's say, a skeptical optimist, maybe not as optimistic as you. What we're seeing currently is that fewer and fewer people are coming physically to the newsstand. Also, it's very, very hard to keep the users at your digital newsstands because most people, and especially the generations to come, are absolutely used to stories coming to them. So they are used to getting them on WhatsApp, on Snapchat, etc., etc. Thirdly, the brand attribution is not in your favor. There is a study by the Reuters Institute in Oxford recently saying that when people consume news over social platforms, they don't attribute them to the brands. They won't say, oh, I read a story Bunte or Bild shared on Facebook. They will say, I got my news from Facebook or from WhatsApp or from Twitter. So when you look at the numbers, and you do look at the numbers of your companies a lot, and take away all the e-commerce and classifieds business, and just boil it down to digital journalism without the subsidies still coming from the traditional print business, how much business value is there actually in digital journalism?
Yeah, I think that the business value of digital journalism will materialize over the next years, and we see it already, because we have had a situation where we were basically in the digital world based on display advertising. Display advertising has significantly deteriorated over the last years. Native advertising and programmatic advertising are very important, and on top of that we are step by step developing a second revenue source, and that is the paying reader. It was for me for more than 10 years obvious that we have to develop that revenue source. Everybody said, no, that's not going to work, you don't understand the internet. New York Times has more than 2 million subscribers. Meanwhile, brands, digital-only brands like Business Insider, like Politico, are generating subs very successfully. Digital brands of former analog media are successful in doing that. So I think it's a turning point also with regard to the attractiveness of the business model, and then you can generate margins of north of 30%, margins that are significantly higher than the margins of analog media brands, and then people will realize that digital journalism is a great and even better business model because you have no paper costs, no distribution costs, and just costs of editorial quality, marketing, and technology, which is getting a lot more important. So I'm deeply optimistic about it. It's just, it takes some time, and it's going to be a development for 10 years, but we need some believers in that. And most of the traditional media companies don't believe in that. That's why the new kids on the block are going to develop that. And also, if you look to the role of a brand, I mean, it's different brands, but young people look for new brands. It's true, 43% of Facebook users say, I read the news on Facebook and not on New York Times or you name it. But new brands, young, cool brands, are very attractive and are working like a club. People want to be a member of that club, want to be part of that cool image. And that's not most of the old media brands.
Paul-Bernhard, Kallen, you promised me that to entertain our audience, you'd be...
The contrarian.
Exactly.
It's a tough thing. I think that traditional media can generate online significant revenues if they want. Good case example is the Wall Street Journal or Financial Times or The Economist. And there are much more brands doing interesting things online and earn money online.
Yes, but they still have huge figures coming from the traditional print business, as all do.
Yes, and the question is, can they shift it from A to B? I don't see why not. I think they are on the move, so I don't see these people disappearing. When I look into entertainment media, entertainment print media, we have a strong position in service and entertainment media. I see them living side by side. And I see that a lot of things that we can do online can start in print, plays a different role online, and where we have combined and mixed business models. And then, of course, there is room for new brands and new digital brands, digital-only brands. And I'm with Mathias Döpfner in my optimism that we will develop and find new brands online, and we are doing so. So the 30% bottom line is something we don't see for now, at least not in these business models. But double digits is something we already see bottom line. So ahead of 10% is something we see already. which has been in the publishing business a good number. So I see more developments than just saying traditionalists, boom, out, and it's all the new kids on the block. We will see different business models, and one of those is a combined business model.
As a journalist, I very much hope both of you are right.
But the journalism, I think the point is we had a sort of a different opinion on journalism. I think the digital journalism is a different, the journalism online, the digital journalism is somewhat different from analog journalism. So in that way, journalism is changing. For instance, when we are reading today, Handelsblatt of today, this is an old newspaper, and nobody did work on that after 5 o'clock yesterday afternoon. So everything what happened tonight is not in that newspaper. That is something we will never accept online. So we will have journalists standing up, not like he did when he was employed in Brussels, 10 o'clock in the morning and working only until noon, because he was a fast writer.
Those were the tiring days.
Yeah, the tiring days. So we will see them waking up at 5 o'clock in the morning, make sure that the digital offering that I'm getting at 7 o'clock when I wake up is fresh and good. So a lot of things will change. They will not only be able to write, they have to have additional skills.
But again,
so that change is something we'll see.
How to make sure that they come to you and not come to Facebook? I know you have different views on whether...
Because we are far more sexy than they are.
I'll just let that go for
Aside.
a moment. So you have
No,
different...
Facebook will not allow them to come, because if they would do, then Facebook will be broken up, and they want to avoid
That's
that.
the thing. That's the point I was just going to get to. I think last year, when you were interviewed by my colleague Dominik Wichmann, there was a controversy about whether Facebook is a media company or not. I think you're in favor of media company. You're saying it should be broken up. If so, since then, Mark Zuckerberg has actually sided with Paul-Bernhard Kallen, saying that Facebook bears responsibility for the content, which sort of turns it a lot more into a media company. And while we're still fighting about definitions, Facebook quietly turns into a very, very large sports channel by getting sports rights from all over the world. It is planning a war room against fake news. I think today news got out that Instagram is going to have a standalone app on shopping. So what do all these developments mean, a war room in particular, do mean for the newsrooms of Die Welt, of Focus, of Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, of Handelsblatt?
So I think it is really an open question, and basically the nuance between what he said and what I said about Facebook is minimal, because we both share the worry that Facebook either is already a media company or will become a media company. It's more almost a kind of tactical approach that I'm saying we should not allow them to become a media company. Politicians should not force them to become a media company. And a media company is, for me, defined by the idea of curation. As soon as you start to select good news, bad news, true news, false news, as soon as you have editors who do that work of investigating and then making decisions and selecting, as soon as you start that, you are truly a media company, and then a media company that is reaching 2 billion, one day 3 billion readers worldwide is simply, I mean, something for a totalitarian society, but definitely not for a democracy. And then it has to be broken up. If they really reduce their role to a kind of more neutral technological platform that connects people and that distributes information, it's a different game. Whether that is realistic or not, we can debate. And again, I think that basically our views are very similar. And now the question is, in which direction does it go? On the one hand, we see these developments that rights are acquired and so on. On the other hand, if, let's say, Facebook asks media companies to produce for them video content, formats that they then distribute exclusively, I think it is a model that I personally could live with. Why not? If Facebook says, we are not creating the content, we are not curating the content,
We're just distributing content that professional publishers have created, and we pay them for that.
But then
Then I think it's a model that we can discuss.
But then a year later, Mark Zuckerberg has a different view and a different idea, and after everybody's been shifting his efforts towards videos, as you just said, and was paid for it for a year, all of a sudden this is gone. Isn't this increasing the dependency on big tech like Facebook?
Surely there is a dependency, and that should vary us. And one of our agendas we are working on is our way to independence of these kind of platforms. And until we haven't achieved it, we are not on safe ground, at least from my perspective. Maybe two comments. The first one's on journalists. Why do they come to us? I think it makes a hell of a difference if you are working in a context that admires journalism, that loves journalism, that creates a certain atmosphere for journalism, rather than in a tech company that allows a few journalists to hang around, not really understanding that they can add some value because the real value is in the coding and not in these kind of people. So I think we will be more attractive and we can live much better with that. I don't fear that journalists will go all to Facebook and none to us. With that I can live. The second thing is more a societal thing. What we really see is a new breed of media company, a new breed of mass media company. The old mass media companies by Luhmann were defined as companies who do not have a back channel for communication. It's not like a communication taking place in the same room. So all is public. All is public means there's a next level of answering, public. There is control through public. So everything is public and everybody understands what's in the newsroom. What we are, what news we take is selected by the people. So what we are seeing on Facebook is the news that you are getting, the news that you are reading is not selected by you, it is selected by Facebook. That you get a different information than he gets with no public control makes a different story. That you have it in other words than he has makes it a different thing. So the influence on that kind of new media on our societies is, from my point of view, a very big point that we have to discuss. And I see sooner or later, either they come up with a solution, how they come to a role that has enough responsibility and transparency, or it becomes an essential facility that somebody else has to create regulation on so that media companies, then real media companies, can use that distribution channels the way it needs to be used.
And that regulation would, of course, come from politics. In most German schools, the most sort of digital education is given to children at break time when they're allowed to use their smartphones, which is quite a sad fact. So I was interested to see Angela Merkel and Olaf Scholz present a new sort of chamber of tech gurus to the public, the German Digital Council. And just hypothetically, if you were on that council, what would be your advice to the German government?
Vis-à-vis education of kids or vis-à-vis education of politicians?
Yes, maybe that
That would be an interesting story, by the way.
I'm more worried about the adults than about the kids, I have to say.
Thank you. I think if we understand the areas, first of all, we have to build on our strengths and should make sure that we build the German economy around our strengths. That means we have to invest into certain things more than we did in the past. Infrastructure is a big thing of it. Secondly, we have to deal with the three threats that we are currently seeing from the internet, unsolved topics, the way we deal with personal data, and the amount of surveillance that comes out of it, I think is dangerous. Secondly, we see new monopolies not allowing enough competition, not allowing enough creativity, not allowing enough innovation than what we could have, because they dominate markets and not just one market, and are able to dominate the next market as well. And thirdly, that we deal with news in a way that is irresponsible. So with these three things we have to deal, and we have to discuss it. Everybody has to understand it. And that most likely would be the 4 points I would discuss with Angela Merkel.
Matthias Döpfner, the European Parliament and the European Commission, very, very hypothetically, created a joint body like that, like the German Digital Council, and you were on it, what would be your advice to that body?
I have also 4 points.
Great, in
I'll
harmony.
try. First would be a legal framework that enables, that stimulates innovation and competition. And that is mainly the publisher's right that's going to be decided here in Brussels on the 12th of September, and then the e-privacy regulation, which would be a suicidal move if it is approved in the present form. So those are 2 very concrete topics that are part of an existential precondition, and that is the legal framework for fair competition. My second point is that we have I think one should establish tax advantages and high-speed company launches in Germany, like the Delaware principle, where you have a guarantee that in 48 hours a new company is founded technically and legally. And I would create tax advantages for young startups, also to help the smaller companies to help and stimulate innovation. Thirdly, I think the European government and national governments need war rooms for artificial intelligence. That is the crucial question of economic and political dominance over the next decades. The level of competence on that front is, for very understandable reasons, very limited in the political spectrum. And I'm not saying that in an arrogant manner these guys don't care or they don't know it. It's so hard to understand that you really need the young experts, the whiz kids, the young developers and geniuses and AI experts to really deeply understand that, because AI is going to be the new form of warfare. The Chinese understand that. You don't send troops, or you don't drop bombs, or you don't need soldiers in order to conquer the world. You do it economically, and you do it with the help of AI. So that is desperately needed and would be a very high priority. And then my 4th point is I agree with everything that you said.
So 4 and 4 makes 7.
In this case, yes. And I think we're going to come to artificial intelligence in a bit. But let's just stick with the copyright directive you mentioned is going to be decided next week. When it comes to the European publisher right, do you sometimes feel like the scientists in the film Jurassic Park that are desperately trying to recreate the DNA of a big beast that evolution is sort of leaving behind, the, I don't know, Spinosaurus Kallen or Tyrannosaurus Döpfner? Are you trying to cling on to something that is
No, I don't get the question, because it has nothing to do with an old DNA. On the opposite, the copyright modernization or directive in Brussels is not for the dinosaurs. It's not for the analog business. For the analog business, completely irrelevant. It's going to die anyway. So whether you have it or not, newspapers are step by step going to disappear. So it has nothing to do with newspapers and with old business. It's all about the precondition, the framework, that a new form of digital journalism can prosper. And it can only prosper if it's a business model. If it's not a business model, and if the business is made by the big American tech monopolies, then there will be no diversity, and that will be very damaging for democracy. And that's why it is really a crucial thing, and it is so much misleading information around, and it's so frustrating. I really don't want to repeat it here. All arguments are exchanged. I think the parliamentarians in Brussels will make independent decisions. Perhaps they take into account that we had a very interesting phenomenon over the last days, that a lot of parliamentarians here in Brussels were impressed by the number of emails they got from opponents against this legal framework, which is actually obvious, because music industry wouldn't exist if they hadn't had this kind of legal framework since the 60s. Now it needs to be implemented for a former analog business that was physical, that is now fluid and non-physical. They get all these emails from the opponents, 60,000 per day, and they're super impressed and think that the net community and the majority of people is against it. And so in the spirit of freedom and to be cool and young, we have to vote against it. And then they organize, the opponents organize protests, a European day of protesting against it. And 60,000 emails per parliamentarian per day compared to 800 people protesting in the whole of Europe. The biggest demonstration took place in Berlin, was around 100 people on the streets. So 800 versus 60,000 emails per day, I think it's a very telling example about the real sentiment on that.
And by the way, it's interesting.
Or the weather in Berlin or Brussels.
And by the way, it's interesting to see how financed it. And it's all foreign money. And it's all US money, by the way. It's so interesting to see. And today there is a Senate hearing, a Senate Intelligence Committee hearing. They are asking Sheryl Sandberg about the foreign influence on platforms. They mean American platforms. If we would have a discussion in the EU about the foreign influence on our platforms, that would be a very interesting discussion. It would take 1 minute, and the answer would be 100%. And even in these things, where they don't have a stake in, they don't run companies in Europe. They are not European companies. Foreigners try to make sure that this kind of right is not given in Europe. Interesting thing. Secondly, if we would do this and write it not in clear language, but we would program it in Python, we could have a patent. And then we could have a patent war afterwards. See for how many $billion Google and these people are suing others because they go against their protected rights. So now we are writing something in clear language, and then it's not creativity, but if we program it in Python, then it's something that we have to protect.
So one thing is to write something down in language, the other thing is the practical use. Are you absolutely convinced that if this, I think it's Article 11, comes through, it'll work practically?
You know what it's going to do? Of course, it will. It's not going to create a big business tomorrow. That is a misunderstanding. It is not at all solving business model problems on day one. But what it does, it establishes a principle that somebody who creates an intellectual property has created a good that has a value, and if somebody else wants to use it for commercial purposes, and only for commercial purposes, the other company, entity, person has to agree on a price. That is the principle. And that is a principle that's true for all goods that you can buy in supermarkets, for physical goods and for other intellectual goods, like music, like movies. It applies everywhere. It just wasn't necessary for newspapers because they were physical, but journalism isn't physical any longer. It's now also fluid, and that's why it needs to have this legal framework. And that principle in the long run, of course, is a precondition in order to try to develop business models. Because if somebody else can just steal what you have created, you have worked for weeks to investigate a story or to create a very entertaining content, and somebody else can just take it, put it into a different context, and sell it towards advertising clients without zero content creation costs, then this is just a kind of hopeless case for the content creators. And in that sense, yes, it is. I think it is, for me, the most existential precondition that digital content can ever become a successful business model. Then it's still up to the publishers to create the content that people want to read and to come up with creative ways to market it and to come up with innovative business models. But this is the legal precondition for everything.
I spent the summer in California, and news came out about the EU hitting Google with a €4 billion fine in the Android case. And the sentiment, and it wasn't just Donald Trump tweeting, it was also classmates at Stanford, a couple of professors. The sentiment was that EU countries are trying to punish US companies because they don't manage to compete with them in the market. Do you think there's any truth in that allegation?
You know, if you would want to do that, there are much more efficient ways. For instance, if you would charge an incoming tax on all services in digital to American platforms, we could take in something like 20 billion a year if we only would take the same tariffs as they take on steel and iron.
So you're taking on Donald Trump now on trade wars?
I personally don't, because it's not my task. But all I'm saying is the underlying story is a monopoly story like we have seen it 10 years ago, 11 years ago with Microsoft. And on Android, it's perfectly the same thing. So somebody owns a certain position in the value chain and is dominating all the others in order to make that their own place. And that is basically after 3 years of investigation, they could have done it in a week. They found out that this is not allowed and that they should do something against it. And now they are breaking up the value chain. At least that's what I'm hoping. Buy an Android smartphone and try not to become a Google customer. You have to vote out 15 times. And if you do that successfully, I'm saying successfully because it's not easy, so you can fail, then you have no longer a smartphone. What you then have is a thing that has a technology of a Nokia in the middle of the 90s, where you can send an SMS and can phone. So they basically own that place. And we think that monopolies are not good for anything, innovation, for instance.
By the way, did you ever try to get rid of WhatsApp? I was on WhatsApp.
Well, you are on WhatsApp.
Yeah, then it was bought by Facebook, and I thought, actually, I don't want to share everything that I'm doing with Facebook, so I drop out. I don't want to use WhatsApp. It is practically impossible. Because what happens once you are registered once, you cannot delete it. It's impossible. You cannot. So what happens is everybody else who's using WhatsApp sees your name in the list of users, is writing you WhatsApp messages. So then what happened, I was always approached by people who said, I sent you 2 weeks ago a message, you did never answer. Are you angry or what's happening? Yeah. So then occasionally I started to check the WhatsApp account in order to see the old messages and somehow find a way to communicate with the people. And then here and there it was so urgent that I started, okay, I have to answer right away. And today I'm back on the WhatsApp trip and I'm totally addicted to it. So it's a real problem.
Bottom line is
Addiction always is a problem, by the way.
That is the drug dealer with the safest business model because it is.
Bottom line is that platform economy is thriving because they're digital products which serve customer needs at very low cost and quite efficiently and quite democratically also. And it sometimes looks like the EU is very efficient and very innovative in creating laws and regulations, but when will our entrepreneurs actually invent something that millions and millions of people will want to use?
I think we invented a lot of things millions and millions of people are wanting to use, like Sing, like...
Platforms. Spotify is there. Spotify is a Swedish.
What is a platform for you?
What we see.
What we see. So small platforms are not platforms, only huge platforms, and global platforms are platforms.
The problem with the global
platforms.
platforms is that they're so big that any small platform created will, with the money involved, if you look what is happening in the Bay Area and the startup scene there, will probably be bought straight away.
Yeah, so that is something I cannot answer. The question is, do we have to have these kind of platforms, or can we have interesting businesses that live in that environment? Do we have to build, we had the discussion in the morning, are we only successful if we are creating companies that are worth 600 billion plus? I think that will not be the European playbook. If we can build 100 companies worth 5 billion, I think it's more helpful for Europe than one company with 500 billion. And most likely it does fit much more to our economies, it does fit much more to the number of people that we are having in this wonderful continent, that we build companies in a middle size that can go eventually up to 30, 40, 50 billion, but we will not have a $1 trillion company coming from Europe because half of the market will be closed for them because that a European company has a role in the US like Google or Facebook has in Europe is absolutely impossible, absolutely impossible. And half of the value of these companies are driven by European value.
But the necessity to think about it is very acute, I agree, because we are always speaking only or mainly about the big US monopolies. Almost nobody speaks about the big Chinese monopolies. And the likelihood that Alibaba, who is already today doing more transactions per day than Amazon, and is growing with a speed and is internationalizing with a speed that is just mind-boggling, and other Chinese companies like Baidu or Tencent, that they are going to be the even more aggressive platforms because they have a regulatory framework that knows only one criteria. What serves the interest of the Chinese totalitarian state is going to be done. And that's also true with regard to everything that is related to AI. So the likelihood that they are just gaining ground and that in the end, you then have just the alternative 3, 4 American super tech monopolies and 3, 4 Chinese super monopolies in Europe, and the rest of the world doesn't play a role. That's quite a scary scenario, and China is probably in the long run a lot more dangerous than the American players.
So what we see from our discussion today is that the two are perfectly aligned. That means Baidu and Google already have an understanding who is going where, and we see it from other giants as well. And that is what we learn in direct talks. So for now, they are saying we separate the world and we don't come too close to each other because it makes us richer if we divide the world and not going into direct competition. And then we will see whether the next step is something like that. But matter of fact, we have to build a platform for Europe, or we have to build a European platform as a bigger thing, not as a browser or something like that. Otherwise, our wells will disappear.
Coming back to AI in regard to journalism, the German language has always been a sort of protective barrier against outside influence. If we look at what AI can do now and what it will be able to do in the next couple of years, is to break down that language barrier. Mark Twain once said, German is an awful language to learn, and AI is going to prove him wrong because by using data, artificial intelligence will learn our language. How important do you think Focus or Die Welt or Bild will still be when any news product from no matter where on the whole world can be read, not only sort of in writing, but will be read to you via artificial intelligence in German?
I think in general, digitization has in a way reduced, lowered, or even destroyed national market entry barriers. In former times, we had logistical issues that were almost unsolvable in other markets. Today, that just doesn't exist because it's a mouse click and everybody can read it and can see it. So the only remaining barrier was truly the language barrier, and that is now solved through a translation that is getting better and better. And if it's written or if it's voice, it's an almost solved problem. So language barriers are no longer barriers, and that's good news, actually. We should see that as an opportunity for German players, for French players, for Italian players, for Belgian players, who used to be in such small markets that they basically had no opportunity to play a significant role globally. And now we have, in a way, you could say, that excuse is just disappearing. We cannot say, sorry, we are in Germany, it's such a small market and it's German and nobody reads and understands German. That's why we cannot create the next, I don't know, Facebook, Snapchat, or the New York Times of the digital age. It's not true. We can do it. And robot journalism is, by the way, also helping us to improve the quality of journalism, because all the quantitative journalism can be done by bots, and human beings can really focus on investigation and analysis, commenting things, so opinions, views, and other things that a computer can probably never replace. So I think that's another reason to be optimistic for the future.
One last question.
If distribution is open, then for us it's a chance. Because that barrier is going away, but other barriers are going away as well. So creative journalists or creative business models can fly everywhere. The key thing, the distribution must be open to everybody, not owned by monopolies that take away people like us, because then we can go out and compete. I love to compete.
I remember there was a time when Springer, I think, had the Sunday monopoly on distribution, which was a wonderful time.
This famous sentence from Rupert Murdoch, who says, I hate monopolies, except if I own them.
Exactly. A monopolist, or soon to be Amazon, Jeff Bezos, has famously said that most large organizations embrace the idea of innovation and invention, but they're not willing to suffer the string of failed experiments necessary to get there. So my last question, to end on a more positive note, are you suffering enough?
Yes. It's a very short one.
Yeah.
All the time.
Since years, every day, we are suffering a lot. There's one exception, but I'm in DLD.
And I think that's the best way to end.